This is a production of Cornell University.
And I can't think of a better way to start a brassica session than with a conversation about maggots, of all things. And actually, I'm first on the program to give this presentation to address the issue that Lorsban is banned and what are we going to do to control cabbage maggot now. So even though I was volunteered to give this presentation, I absolutely want to acknowledge my colleagues and my peers that are involved with this project, and they are participating in this session, so we'll be available to answer questions as well. So they're Dr. Faruque Zaman. He is with Cornell Cooperative Extension in Suffolk County on Long Island, and Brian Nault with Cornell Entomology at Agri-Tech in Geneva. So hopefully you all have heard that Lorsban and its active ingredient and other generics with this active ingredient are banned in New York State. They are no longer allowed to be used for feed and food uses. And the last day that it was legal to use Lorsban was July 31st in 2021, so last July. New York is not alone in this. Recently, the EPA has revoked tolerances for chlorpyrifos, and it may no longer be used for food or feed crop that will be sold in the United States. That comes into the effect February 28th, 2022. So that is next Monday. So no more chlorpyrifos for food uses in the United States, or at least for crops that are sold in the United States. So what does that leave us? Well, this is a list of the insecticides that are labeled in New York on brassicas for control of cabbage maggot. They include diazinon and various formulations of this. This is an organophosphate, which is in the same class as Lorsban and chlorpyrifos was. Radiant, which is a class 5. It is labeled as a directed spray at 100 gallons per acre. Capture LFR and various generics are pyrethroids. That is labeled as an in-furrow application. Coragen and Verimark are diamides, group 28. Labeled as transplant water drenches, in-furrow, directed sprays at the base. Verimark is the only one that's labeled as a trade drench. Coragen and Verimark are not available on Long Island if there's anybody participating from Long Island. Coragen and Radiant are labeled for suppression only. And the reason I have Capture LFR shaded here is because Cornell research on Long Island, looking at this active ingredient or this material as an IF, has not been effective. So we are not recommending that for cabbage maggot at this time. So I'm going to present to you today's results from several research trials. And I just want to acknowledge that funding was from the New York Farm Viability Institute, Northeast SARE, the New York Cabbage Research and Development Program. I'd like to acknowledge Root Brothers for hosting the trial that Brian and I conducted this summer. And Dan Gilring, he's an entomologist on Long Island who wins the award for cabbage maggot longevity. He's worked with this pest longer than any of us. And then a whole slew of technicians for helping with the trial evaluations. This is my team, Emma and Sarah. And so with we want to control cabbage maggot so it doesn't stunt the yield of our crops so that we have healthy, big cabbage. So for my trial, or the trial that I did with Brian in Oakfield this past summer, we went into that with the objective to identify effective, affordable, and convenient alternatives to chlorpyrifos for control of cabbage maggot. So we were focusing on trying to use lower rates of the more expensive products, directed sprays at the base of the plant, because that's the most convenient application. We also had some transplant water applications. But we're looking at any trade drenches because that's the most inconvenient. And then also I inherited a project from Dennis Willett, who has left Cornell, but that was to look at entomopathogenic nematodes. And I won't really talk about too much about that in this presentation. So as I mentioned, we were on farm for this trial at Root Brothers. This was on ground that's rotated with dairy farms, so it's very heavily manured. It's the first field that they plant in the season, so the trial was set up on May 1st, and this site has a history of heavy cabbage maggot pressure using the growers' configurations. We were at the edge of the field, so you can see it was long and lean, 3 plots wide and probably like 500 feet long or something like that. And we were using plug plants, which were Speedway Conqueror was the variety. So when I talk about the directed spray at the base of the plant, so how we set this up in the small plot, I just went over with a single nozzle backpack sprayer. I applied 40 GPA, that's what I'm set up to do, unless the label specified something different. With Radiant did, which is 100. So instead of switching the nozzles, I adjusted my walking speed, but I gotta say I was going really slow. It was kind of crazy. But that's how I adjusted that. And then I ended up, I think my band was more 4 to 6 as opposed to just at 4, but you can see the coverage there. For the transplant water applications on a small scale, so what we did is we used 600 gallons per acre. We did a lot of math. We had to figure out how much volume of both product and water is going down per row foot. And what we came up with was 1 fluid ounce per plant. But we didn't want to put all of that insecticide in that foot in the one plant because we thought that would be too concentrated. So we just took that number and divided it by 4 and said, okay, a quarter of what goes down a foot is going to get into that plant. So that's how we calculated that. Just gently remove the already planted plants, slosh some water in, put the plant in, slosh some more water in, tucked it in and gave it another little drink. And this is Sarah, we called Sarah our bartender. She was serving up drinks and we were feeding our cabbage plants. For the pre-plant incorporated application, so the freshly planted plants, just gently remove them, backpack sprayed across the surface, hoed them in, just with a garden hoe there, manually incorporated to about 3 to 4 inches according to the label, and then replanted the plants. We also had an in-furrow granular application. So we didn't bother pulling out plants and redigging a furrow. We just sprinkled that granular over the top and then just kind of tucked it in a little bit. So it wasn't exposed on the surface, but it was really in line with near the soil line there in the stem where we would want to have that placed anyway. So just take a look at what the maggots were doing during the time of this trial. This is the cabbage maggot degree day model that's available in NUA. And this is the Elba weather station because we don't have one in Oakfield. And so it just shows when the overwintering generation is present, the first, the second, and the third generation. And so peak emergence of the overwintering generation occurred on May 7th. So the cabbage maggot overwinter in the soil as pupa. They emerge as flies, they find a mate, they lay their eggs, the larvae hatch, they feed for about 3 weeks, then they pupate, and after 2 to 4 weeks, the pupa emerges flies again. So the peak emergence of the flies of the first generation was June 14th, and then the third, June 15th, and the fourth, August 12th. And instead of using the cabbage maggot degree day, you can use biological indicators, which are yellow rocket, daylily, goldenrod, and New England asters. So we planted the trial on May 1st. That's when the treatments were applied. And then we evaluated them on June 11th. So we are definitely hitting the first generation, maybe just starting into the second generation. So when we were evaluating on June 11th, 6 weeks since those applications went on, we saw larvae from the first generation as well as some pupa from the first generation. And we may have started to see maggots from the first generation, but the vast majority of what we were looking at was first generation maggot feeding. We took note if we saw pupa or not. So if we had a treatment that was very effective, we would not expect to see any pupa. If we had a treatment that was initially effective, but maybe it ran out of gas and the maggots were coming in the last couple of weeks, if we didn't see pupa in that situation, that would be an indication that at one time it was working very well. Whereas if we saw pupa, that meant that it was letting maggot through the whole entire time, if that makes sense. So this is just a visual of the adults, the eggs being laid at the soil line, the maggots feeding on the roots, and then there's a pupa. So we'll take a look at the results from this trial. We're looking at percent cabbage maggot infestation. So that includes whether we found maggots in the plants or whether we found evidence of their feeding. And so this is the untreated, we had 51 or 52% damaged plants, which is a pretty good infestation. The black indicates the number of the stunted plants that had cabbage maggot. So actually, we had stunting throughout this trial for reasons other than cabbage maggot. We only had 33% of the stunted plants were infested with cabbage maggot. So here's what an example on June 10th of what the untreated checks looked like. So you can see we had some variability. We had some issues going on in this trial with stunting. We had some cultivator blight, would have been one of the issues. So I've starred here the two treatments that had significantly fewer infested plants than the untreated. They include the Lorsban, the directed spray, getting us halfway there, 48% control. It's banned, so let's move on. The best treatment at 93% control or reduction of infested plants was diazinon Ag 500 at the highest rate in transplant water. We also didn't see any pupa. It had been working great the entire time. We had no stunted plants with cabbage maggot in them. However, we did see a general 46% stunting from this treatment 25 days after treatment. And it actually says on the label that diazinon in transplant water can stunt plants. So here's what the diazinon looked like on June 10th. They're starting to come out of it. Here's the untreated. So you can kind of see the stunting that happened there with that treatment. The other issue with diazinon Ag 500 is that it has a lot of PPE that's required if engineering controls are not feasible, which they are not with your transplant, with the guy sitting on the transplanter. They're going to have to wear coveralls, chemical resistant gloves, not just the nitrile gloves, but the barrier laminate, which are the crunchy ones, not very dexterous for handling transplants, chemical resistant footwear, mixers and loaders wearing the aprons, goggles, and an organovapor respirator with organovapor cartridges. And it's for federally restricted use, which requiring on-site supervision of non-certified handlers. So your tractor driver running that crew would have to have a license or would need to have on-site supervision. So it's not the most user-friendly. So what about the PPI, the pre-plan incorporated? Well, here it is, high rate. It's not significantly different than the untreated. We did see some stunting, 23%, not as much, but it's more diluted when it's a broad acre spray like that, and it's not targeting the stem of the plants at the soil line as well. So not nearly as effective as the transplant water application. Here's what diazinon PPI looked like. Okay, moving on. Let's take a look at Verimark. We looked at this as a directed spray at 6.5 fluid ounces, which is actually, it's within the label rate, but it's lower than the label rate recommended for cabbage maggot. We were going for economics here, comparing that, of course it didn't do anything, comparing that to the high rate, 13.5, and we got 43% better control or fewer infested plants. So we can see a rate relationship there. Then we tried the 6.5 ounce rate in transplant water, and it was somewhere in between. So not quite as good as the high rate. I also had Verimark with nematodes, the low rate in transplant water, and same thing as without the nematodes. Nematodes weren't bringing anything to the table. All right, and here's what the Verimark looked at. We had very little stunting with this treatment. This is the 6.5 rate over as the base directed spray, the 13.5 ounce rate. And for some reason, I had stunting with the transplant water a little bit. And then here's the transplant water treatment with the nematodes where I didn't have any stunting. So that was kind of curious. Okay, moving on, Radiant. Here we looked at a directed spray at the base, 100 GPA, 5 fluid ounces, the lowest rate, 7.5, 10 ounces, which is the higher rate. Not really seeing much of a rate relationship going on there. And we got better control with the lower rate. And then we tried a double application of 5 ounces at planting and then another 5 ounces 18 days later, which was no different than the higher rate. So really not seeing too much of a rate response there. And it's kind of similar to the high rate of Verimark over the top. Also had it in the transplant water at the low rate, and that didn't really do much for us either. And we did see pupa, and we had some stunting in this trial. So this is Coragen, 5 ounces in transplant water, nothing spectacular. It's labeled as suppression only. Still not working very well, even with the nematodes. Here's that force, the inferogranular application. This is not labeled, but Syngenta was curious and maybe this could be a potential solution in the future. It's a pyrethroid, a potentially affordable option. I don't know how user-friendly the granular, inferogranular application is, but you can see it didn't really work that great. And then we tried following it up with an application of Radiant 18 days later, which improved a little bit, but none of these differences are really significant. Okay, so now let's take a look at Faruque's data from Long Island. We're looking at 2018, 2019, and 2020 trials in blue, red, and green. And now we're looking at percent roots without damage. So here it's the opposite. The tall bars are the best treatments. And you can see there's not, in 2018 and 2020, there's pretty high pressure. There's not very many plants left that don't have any damage. So which is the best treatment? It's actually insect exclusion netting. Almost 100% control, even under high pressure. He was using TechNet 80 gram mesh. So obviously not an option for large scale, but for any small scale growers there, insect exclusion netting looked very good. So that's kind of an organic option. Another treatment in this trial that would have an organic use would be Entrust, which was applied as a tray drench, followed by a directed spray 14 days later. And actually the tray drench is not labeled. Entrust is actually not labeled for cabbage maggot. It is labeled in Brassicas. Potentially there could be some incidental control. And it's got some activity. It's better than nothing, but there's treatments that are better. So I just wanted to mention that while we were here. All right, what is the second best treatment after insect exclusion netting? It was Lorsban as a directed spray. We don't have that anymore, so let's keep looking. Verimark, also performing very well in this trial. This time it's applied as a tray drench followed by a directed spray 14 days later. So we're double lap of the high rate. This is a lot of Verimark here. Depending on the year, control range from 55 to 82%. The least effective was Radiant. So a little bit more about the tray drench applications. So the way you figure out the rate is you take the product rate per acre, you divide that by the number of plants per acre, and that's going to give you how many fluid ounces are going to go per plant. Then you multiply that by 200 plants in a tray, and then you figure out how much you need to put on a tray. And then you have to figure out how much water that goes in. And that's going to be experimenting just to figure out how much water you need to saturate the plugs and but not to the point of runoff, because you don't want your insecticide to run out of the bottom. So what worked out for Faruque was 4.7 mils or 0.16 fluid ounces in 1 pint of water per tray. He sprayed that over the top and then came back with another pint of water per tray over top of the foliage to wash it in. And the label states that the treated plants need to be planted within 72 hours of this application. They also recommend not watering for 24 hours before you make the applications. And so then you can make sure that the insecticide gets in the ball where they need to be. So to compare a directed spray to a tray drench, I pulled some data from California. We're looking at percent plants with maggot injury. So high bars are bad. The untreated had 35% of the plants were injured. And for Verimark high rate, Radiant high rate, we're comparing a tray drench versus a directed spray. And you can see in the side-by-side comparisons that the tray drench has 2 to 3 times more injured plants than the tray drench does. I don't know if I said that right. The directed spray has more infestation than the tray drench. So this is a consistent trend that we're seeing throughout all the research trials that we've been looking at. What's published in the literature. The tray drench seems to be the most effective way the most effective application technique for using these types of products. And it makes sense When we were doing our trial evaluating the plugs, we saw all kinds of maggots stuck in that root ball. So if that root ball is full of insecticide, you just have to believe that's going to go a long way towards controlling the maggots. So everything I've talked about so far has been total infestation. But obviously there's a difference between a plant that's severely infested that has no root left and that can cause stunting versus one that's just got a few feeding canals and it's probably not going to affect yield loss at all. So in our trial last year, we did not look at that. So all of my treatments that are not significantly different, if we were to look at severity, I bet you we would start seeing, they would start separating out. And that's what we plan to do moving forward. But Faruque has been doing this the whole time, and he's been using a scale of 1 to 10 in increasing severity with, I think he said anything in the 3 to 1 category is not going to affect yield. Certainly something that's an 8 to 10 is going to cause serious economic losses. So here's his data with respect to root damage severity. This is the 2018 to 2020 trials again. So you can see in those 2 years, we had 2018 and 2020, very high pressure, approaching 3.5. Of course, that's an average. There's going to be some of those plants, as we know, that are going to have high levels of infestation, but that's a pretty high average. And you can see all of the treatments in that trial had very minor injury at averaging out at ones. So in truth, you know, I think we know that brassicas can tolerate a certain extent of feeding without it causing marketable damage. And another thing to point out, this is with respect to Verimark in Faruque's 2020 trial. He's looking at percent leaf damage caused by flea beetle and caterpillars, the untreated in the column on the right, and a black plastic mulch, which is essentially an untreated. And you can see that they've got very high levels of damage, or 10%, whatever. And then the Verimark, though, like absolutely no feeding damage at all, no caterpillar feeding. So Verimark also is offering protection against flea beetles and caterpillars. And that's the trade drench followed by a directed spray 14 days later. You see Radiant and Lorsban have a little bit of activity on flea beetle, but they didn't do very well in this trial for the caterpillars. And then this chart here is a head quality rating at harvest. And so the untreated is very poor. The exclusion netting is pretty good, but even better than the exclusion netting was Verimark. So really nice looking heads at the end of harvest because it's controlling other pests other than just cabbage maggot. And there wasn't any further insecticides applied to control these other pests. So that's really showy in this data. All right, I want to finish with one last data set, saving the best for last. This is Faruque 2021. We're looking at roots without damage, so tall bars are good. And in this trial, the untreated had 42%, only 42%, less than half of the plants were healthy. You can see 5 stars up here that were significantly better than the untreated, with giving 85 to 97% clean plants, representing 74 to 95% control. So what are they? Well, 4 of those treatments are a new experimental pipeline product. Won't be available for 2022, but hopefully this is something that you will see in your future. Here's Verimark, just as a point of reference, 56% control. And this is just with the trade drench, not with that follow-up directed spray 14 days later. So what's this mystery remaining star? What is it? What is it? It is Mustang Max, a directed spray, a pyrethroid over the top, or directed spray at the base of the plant at planting, and then every week for three weeks after, for a total of 4 sprays, giving 80% control. So the thing about Mustang Max, it's labeled on brassicas for flea beaters and caterpillars and onions. It's not specifically labeled on cabbage maggot. There could be some incidental control of cabbage maggot, but I would suspect that would only occur if you're actually spraying it at the base of the plants. But I think this is something that our team is going to look at to see if we can get a 2EE label, because that would be relatively simple and probably affordable as well. All right, so to summarize the alternatives that we have for Lorsban, well, the diazinon is one of them. The transplant water application is by far more effective than the pre-plant incorporated. Not that the PPI wouldn't have any utility under lower pressure, I would presume, but under high pressure, you would, I think it would fall apart for you. This has the longest residual control, but there's a lot of things against it. There's the risk of stunting. So you want to apply an insecticide so cabbage maggot doesn't stunt your cabbage, but the product you're using can stunt the cabbage. So kind of, I don't know, may or may not negate itself there. It's federally in New York State restricted. It's got extensive PPE for the transplant water application, and it doesn't offer any control of flea beetles or cabbage worms. So the other alternative is Verimark trade drench. The high rate is averaging about 65 to 80% control, which increases by 10 to 15% when you follow that up with a directed spray at the base 2 to 3 weeks later. Our trials have been with Verimark, but theoretically it could be something else. It also offers excellent control of flea beetles and caterpillars. The rate, it varies by your plant population. So the highest density plantings are going to get the lowest rate per plant. So that's something I think we need to look into a little bit further as we move forward with our trials, is what is the rate per plant that really works, and work back that way. It's very user friendly. I don't even think the PPE requires gloves. It's just long sleeve pants, long sleeve shirt and pants, long sleeve sleeves and pants, and shoes and socks. It is expensive. It's probably around $100 for that high rate. But you have to factor in what is the value of the flea beetle and the worm control that you're going to get in that package. And the transplant trade drench is certainly inconvenient. I know growers are pretty good at figuring things out, and I think once a system's figured out, it'll probably work, but it's going to be a learning curve, and it doesn't offer the residual that the diazinon does. It'll probably start running out of gas around that 4-week mark, I think. So far from our work, the transplant water and the directed sprays at the base are much less effective than the transplant or than the trade drench. So not strongly recommending those right now, especially with the cost of this product. You'll get some activity with Radiant. It hasn't been a shiny star, but it is labeled. And then just a reminder for organic use, there is insect exclusion netting, which is phenomenal, and it also controls flea beetles and caterpillars, also Swede Midge. I'll talk about that a bit later. The caveat is you have to put it on ground that's rotated out of brassicas. You don't want insect pests to emerge into the netting, and you don't want to be transplanting plants into it that are already infested with worms, for example. It's expensive, it's labor intensive, it's not ideal for large scale, but it's not just for organic. A conventional grower could potentially get a lot of use out of insect exclusion netting. So there's a lot more to come. That's where we're at. This is the Cornell cabbage maggot team. As I mentioned, Dan Gilgrain gets the award for cabbage maggot longevity. We are Faruque, Zaman, myself, and Brian Nault, and both of them are on the Zoom today. So if there's any questions, I guess I'm going to stop sharing my screen right now. Gemma, do you want to launch our poll? So the question is, just a little activity for you. How are you feeling about cabbage maggot control without Lorsban? Okay, so 56% good, 7% excellent, 19% not good. Emma, were there any questions in the chat, or does anybody want to say
Christy, may I say something real quick?
Yeah.
First of all, excellent job. You really covered this topic really, really well. So I want to mention that first. The other is maybe just to elaborate on just a couple of the comments that you made. And the first is that even though there are multiple cabbage maggot generations over the course of the summer, it seems that the biggest problems occur with that first generation. And that perhaps a Verimark drench or any other type of control may not be necessary for plantings later in the summer. So that's one point. And the other is in terms of the Verimark potentially running out of gas after 4 or 5 weeks, again, is if that plant can get established pretty well, I feel like, even if there are some maggots that infest the plant, it's probably not going to hurt the plant because the root system is going to be pretty well developed. So I think it's just critical for those earliest plantings and to really get that protection for, a good 4 to 5 weeks and should be good. So anyway, that's all I wanted to elaborate. But thank you for an excellent presentation.
And thank you for taking on cabbage maggot, Brian. All right, well, I didn't plan to roll right into the next presentation, but I guess Thomas is delayed and will be joining us later. So we're just going to keep working with the maggot, because the larvae of Swede Midge is also a maggot. And you're going to hear from me again. I'm going to talk about new developments for managing Swede Midge in brassica crops. From 2015 to 2017, I worked with 7 small-scale organic brassica farms in New York State, from Ithaca to Olean in the southern tier. And we were monitoring Swede Midge populations intensively and relating that to management practices and damage that we were seeing on the crop, as well as conducting several on-farm trials and demonstrations. And so we learned a tremendous amount about Swede Midge through that project, for which I wanted to share with you some of the highlights today. So hopefully everybody knows what Swede Midge is. It's a tiny little fly. It's only 2 millimeters in size. Truthfully, you're probably not going to see them in your brassica crops unless you're monitoring for them and you see a dead body on a sticky card. Those tiny little flies lay tiny little eggs. They target the growing points of plants. They really like that newly developing tissue. Those tiny eggs hatch into larvae. And the larvae, I gotta say, these can be tricky to find too if you don't know what you're looking for. And so I just wanted to let you know that a few years ago, I made a diagnostic video. It's only 1 minute. If you do a search, Better Know a Pest Swede Midge, it should pop up and it'll just walk you through the steps you need to take to find those actual larvae. Because the damage that Swede Midge causes can be confused with other ailments of brassicas because they tend to morph. So to really confirm you have Swede Midge, ideally you like to find the culprit. So this is just an example of puckering, leaf puckering damage that Swede Midge can cause. When they're feeding on the growing point and that gets disrupted, you can have multiple side shoots or heads, as in the case of cabbage. And as you know, several things can cause this to occur in cabbage heads, and certainly not always Swede Midge. What's really diagnostic for me is the brown corky scarring, which when it's in the head of cauliflower broccoli deems the marketable portion of the plant unmarketable. So a little can cause a lot of damage. What's important to know about the life cycle, just like the cabbage flies, it overwinters in the soil as pupa, emerges as adults, have 3 days to mate. They lay a whole bunch of eggs that hatch within 3 days. The larvae feed for 2 to 3 weeks. They drop to the soil to pupate and then emerge after 1 to 2 weeks, and the cycle starts again. We have about 4 or 5 overlapping generations in New York. This is trap catch data from one of the farms that I work with. First trap catches were around May 15th. We certainly never caught anything in April, never caught anything the first week of May. And our last trap catches, honestly, could be in November. So the blue lines here, these are the spring emergence sites. So this is where you had an infested brassica the previous fall. So this is where they're emerging in the spring. And then you can see they're moving into the summer planting, and they're moving into the spring, and from the spring to the summer, and then into the fall. And you can see all along the way, when it's not well controlled, they can build tremendously within a season. And you can see multiple overlapping generations. And now that our falls are getting warmer, this patch is going fairly strongly throughout the month of October. So conventionally, it's relatively easy to control Swede Midge with insecticides. This is the roster of what we have labeled in New York: Neonics, Warrior, Movento, and Exarel, belonging to 4 different classes. The Neonics, Movento, and Exarel are probably going to get you very good to excellent control. So even if you're using these products for thrips or aphids or worms, you're probably going to be getting control of, again, incidental control of Swede Midge. And I just also wanted to mention that Coragen, Besiege, and Verimark, I mentioned that earlier. These are other group 28 insecticides labeled in Brassicas, not specifically for Swede Midge, but again, when you're using them to control your worms or your maggots or whatever else, that you're probably controlling Swede Midge at the same time. So just wanted to point that out. My experience working with conventional growers, I see cabbage maggot every now and again. I personally have never seen it cause economic damage. And usually a grower might just tweak his spray program just a little bit to maybe use one of these products that'll get that Swede Midge population under control or preventing it from even getting out of control, probably more realistic. The other most effective way to manage Swede Midge is with far and wide crop rotation. And with like large scale cabbage production where a field's only going into cabbage maybe every 4 years and it's being rotated with field crops, predominantly vine crops, Swede Midge doesn't really stand a chance. But organic growers are more vulnerable because they tend to be small scale. And so the small land base with a high proportion of that acreage cropped to brassica crops and multiple planting season long really negates the ability to rotate effectively. And also organic insecticides are nowhere near as good as conventional insecticides. But through all that work that I did with the small scale growers and monitoring their populations, we were able to come up with new crop rotation recommendations that are much more easier for them to implement than the original recommendations, which were 3,000 feet between brassica crops, just thinking just the farther the better, and then 3 years. And the thought behind the 3-year was because a portion of those pupa will overwinter in the soil for more than a year. So what I was able to do is get that down to about 500 feet. However, there's a caveat here. The fields must be separated. They must be secluded fields separated by a substantial barrier, such as a wooded area, to really get so those flies get lost in going from one field to another. I was working on farms that had either an 8-acre or 12-acre field with maybe 500 feet between one side of the field and the other. The Swede Midge eventually did find their way to the brassicas. So without a barrier, 500 feet is not enough. So I want to make that clear. And basically we get that 3 years down to 2.5 to 3 months, which is basically you can go back into the same field. You just have to wait until that spring emergence has subsided. So these new recommendations are, which I'll explain I'll explain more in a moment, but I just wanted to let you know that there's a new fact sheet out that outlines all of them. So if you just do a search for crop rotation Swede Midge, you should find our fact sheet ready enough. So to illustrate the waiting for spring emergence to subside, these are the dashed line is the trap catches of the spring emergence. So this is the site where you had infested brassicas the previous fall. And then the solid line is the Swede Midge in the, this is red cabbage. And so in this case, they planted the cabbage on April 25th, so overlapping with spring emergence, and the Swede Midge had no trouble finding the red cabbage. And by the end of the season, only 28% of those heads were marketable. This is when you're catching almost 100 Swede Midge per trap per day. So this is really heavy infestation. Here's another field where they planted the red cabbage on July 22nd. So you can see the spring emergence has really subsided here. It's not gone completely, but it's certainly not at this level. And yeah, it found the red cabbage, but they ended up with 98% marketable heads. So this proved to be a very effective way of being able to go back into the same field. You just have to delay the planting 2 or 3 months until the spring emergence has subsided. So as I mentioned, it only works with secluded fields that are separated by a significant barrier. You have to make sure that the transplants are not infested with Swede Midge. That was an issue in some of the farms I work with, that they held off on brassica production and they went in the fall, but then their brassicas were the transplants are full of Swede Midge, so it completely defeated the purpose. And it's very helpful to combine crop rotation with post-harvest crop destruct to prevent Swede Midge populations from building. I'll illustrate that in a moment. And also avoiding cover crops such as mustard types cover crops, when you're rotating away from brassicas, they don't tend to be the most preferred host, but if that's all they're given, you know, if you have another option, I would recommend it. So this is just an example of how Swede Midge can build after harvest. So this is the main harvest of broccoli where there's practically no Swede Midge at all. And just as they let it go to harvest the secondary side shoots, it starts to build. Then their flail mower is broken, and next thing you know, the crop isn't. By the time the crop is mowed, that population has increased 13-fold to very, very high levels. I would have rather just got some of that secondary side shoot harvest, flail mold it, and cut all this out. So this is the crop rotation outline that's in the fact sheet. So basically it starts with a farm that has 2 fields that are heavily infested. And so the grower's going to have to take one of those fields out of production, and in the other, wait until the spring emergence has subsided before he goes in, or she goes in, with fall brassicas. Then in the second year, you basically pick the field that you think has the lowest pressure, which in this case would be the field that we took out of rotation completely. We're going to run spring and summer brassicas in that field. We're not going to take them through the entire season because we don't want the Swede Midge to build up that far. And then switch to the other field after spring emergence has subsided to come in with the fall brassicas. And then it's just a constant flip-flopping back and forth with planting your spring and summer brassicas in the one field, and then finishing up the fall ones after spring emergence has subsided in the other. Monitoring Swede Midge, so you kind of have an idea what this invisible pest is doing on your farm, can be done with pheromone traps. And if you're interested in that, if you go to the Swede Midge Information Center in the US, just click on monitoring and detection, and it goes through where to get the traps, how to identify a Swede Midge on a sticky card. It's really quite useful. And the other thing that came out of that work was, what is the relative preference of Swede Midge of the different brassica crops? And so we actually we lined them up in a scale here. This is in that fact sheet as well, with the most preferred being red Russian kale, followed by broccoli. Broccoli, of course, if you have a little bit of scarring in a head versus a kale where you have several leaves to choose from, we tend to see the highest economical losses with broccoli. And then on the other end, the more tolerant crops are the Asian brassicas, Chinese and Savoy cabbage and bok choy, winter boar kale, turnips and radishes. So if you're in a situation where you've got Swede Midge, you want to plant some brassicas, maybe you can plant some of these more tolerant ones. And it's amazing what high pressure of Swede Midge I have seen Chinese cabbage withstand, or bok choy for that matter, without they don't go to it. Even in a cage, I had them in a cage. They had no choice. They still didn't want to infest it. It was fascinating to me. But if you're in a situation where you have a susceptible brassica and you've got a high Swede Midge population, there is the option of insect exclusion netting. We have demonstrated it several times to provide 100% of control of Swede Midge, just like it does a phenomenal job controlling cabbage maggot. What we're talking about is Protect Net 25 grams. It costs about $200 for 100 feet of protection, and that's with the 4-foot hoops. And then you have about another $200 in the supplies, the hoops, the clamps, the anchors, and whatnot. It needs to be secured, which is labor intensive. Sometimes we rock it in, sometimes we sod it in, and it's best when it's accompanied with a mulch. This is landscape fabric, whether it's a plastic mulch, straw mulch, but that helps keeps the weeds out, so you don't have to go in there to weed. And if you don't secure the sides, they can blow in the wind, weeds can lift them up, animals can get in there. Once Swede Midge gets in there, they do very well inside this environment. Another advantage to the insect exclusion netting is we have advanced maturity. You can see that these were planted at the exact same time, the difference between outside and in the hoop or inside the netting. Some of that is because they provide phenomenal control of flea beetles, as I already mentioned, caterpillars as well. On the other side, as I mentioned before, if you put transplants underneath netting that's already infested, they are going to go crazy in there. It's going to look like a snow globe of cabbage butterflies. I've seen it. It's a thing. Also, if you're not weeding like in the hoops, it can be a good environment for slugs. So, fix one pest and create another. So that's something to be aware of. You might want to weed or use some slug bait or something. The economics of the insect exclusion netting, because it's very expensive, it's only economically feasible under high pressure situations. So if you're standing to lose 50% of your crop or more, and you've got a high value crop, so something like $3 per pound broccoli. Otherwise, you may as well just grow broccoli in the open air and feed half of it to the Swede Midge. You get to the same place. However, if you see the advantages of the flea beetle and the worm control, that could play into that decision. The advanced maturity, and also what's the value of keeping a potentially lucrative market. I don't know if I think I mentioned this, I'm not sure if I did, but again, this has to be rotated to ground that hasn't been cropped to brassicas in about 3 years. So we had a study with a permanent bed system. We literally moved 3 beds over from a severely infested spot to one that hadn't been cropped to brassicas and grew, had perfect control of Swede Midge. The netting can be reused to an extent. If you're rocking it in, it comes out a little bit better than if you're sodding it in. If you're sodding it in, it tends to tear when you remove it. So this grower used this netting on the 4-foot tunnels in broccoli and then turned it around and put it over top of kohlrabi. So he could reuse it that way. And lastly, the last thing I'm working on, for the farms where they can't rotate, insect exclusion netting is just not working, is the idea of using ground barriers that you would put over top of an infested site. And so the Swede Midge would theoretically emerge under there and perish. Then you can pull off the tarp and you've crashed your Swede Midge population. So while your infested ground is containing the Swede Midge, theoretically you could grow your broccoli right beside it. So I've looked at landscape fabric, tarp, and plastic mulch. And I tried the plastic mulch with and the landscape fabric with and without holes, because I was wondering if you could just put onions in or something like that. Turns out Swede Midge have no trouble finding the holes. So if you're going to have to take the ground out of production, we're down to tarping and landscape fabric. Both of these will result in different moisture and temperature conditions under the tarp, which could affect what happens to the Swede Midge. But so far in my preliminary small cage trials that were done with artificial Swede Midge inoculation, when we pulled the barriers off after 30 and 46 days, there was no more emergence. So we assume that they perished. But the next step is to try this with a naturally infested soil where you've got overlapping generations emerging at different times. And we really want to know how long do those tarps have to be, or does that ground barrier have to be there? And that is it. And I'm at 12:51. We're expecting Thomas at 12:55. So funding for this project, Northeast Air Partnership Program, Northeast IPM, and the Cornell's Towards Sustainability Foundation. So I'm going to stop sharing so I can see.
Christy, we have one question in the chat. Lauren would like to know, does anybody have experience using netting without hoops?
Oh, yes, you can. Yeah, you can use it. Just placing it over top a low, like a lower to the ground crop. Again, just securing it so it doesn't blow away, and so that Swede Midge doesn't get under it. But that can work too. All right. So is Thomas here?
I am indeed.
Oh, Thomas, I was going to make a maggot sandwich out of you. I was going to talk about a maggot and then have you talk about broccoli and then me maggot again.
I know.
It's maggot, broccoli. Okay, so Thomas is going to talk about potential solutions to the 5 most common reasons why growers don't go broccoli. So I have an F word for broccoli, and that is fickle. So Thomas is a plant physiologist with the Department of Horticulture at Cornell Agri-Tech. And I think I don't know, was it 12 years ago that okay, so 12 years ago, he decided that he wanted to lead the Eastern Broccoli Project, which has the ambitious goal of developing a broccoli industry in the Eastern United States. So the never lacking ambition, Thomas Bjorkman, tell us how to solve pickle broccoli problem.
Yeah. So thanks a lot. And yeah, thanks for accommodating the time switch. I just got back to talking to the Ontario growers. just pulled in. So yeah, thanks for accommodating the time shift. So fickle broccoli, it is challenging. There's no question. There's a lot of opportunity. There are people who are making it work, and it's working well for them. When we first started this project, the idea was New York State is a great place to grow cabbage. People really know how to produce cole crops, and the land is really well suited for it. The climate, except for a couple of small issues, is well suited to it. We should do great with this. And one of the first things we realized is that if you're making money growing cabbage, you don't want to give up any cabbage ground for broccoli, and the management is completely different once you've harvested it. So it turns out that cabbage growers were actually some of the least likely growers. So it's a little bit challenging to talk at this session about why to grow broccoli. I realize that's a challenge, but I see on the participant list that some of you have done it and have quite a few answers to this question also. But looking back over a lot of the things, I'm gonna just summarize some of the things we have. So these are not easy problems to solve. That has not changed, but there are some things to look at. But first of all, start optimistically. Why should you raise broccoli? So it is still true as it was 12 years ago that locally grown produce is in demand. There are quite a few buyers who are interested in getting it. The landscape for that has changed a little bit, as markets always do. We have reduced transportation costs versus California. So I just checked this week, a reefer from Salinas to New York costs $11,000. So that's $11 a box. And so if you're getting $20 a box, then you've got about a 55% advantage if your transportation costs were nothing, but they're not. It's a big advantage, right? So you can take advantage of that to be able to deliver even if your production costs are higher than California. The market is still interested in a reduced footprint or sustainably produced. These are all important things to many buyers, and New York growers can deliver on that. For many growers, crop diversification is valuable. That's why broccoli is grown in California at all, is for diversification of the lettuce production areas. That's the whole big driver behind it. And so for having a greater diversity of markets, greater diversity of timing in the crops that you're growing. So with cabbage growers, obviously, that's one of the problems that I'm going to be talking about. And looking nationally, having a diversification of the supply sources for broccoli or any crop is important. If all of it is in one valley, then the country's at risk for a shortage. There's no doubt about it. That's not a compelling reason for an individual grower, but it is a compelling reason for Congress. Then California expansion of broccoli to meet the continually growing demand for broccoli is limited by the amount of land and water that they have, and more of the water. And in fact, for the last 5 or 6 years, the increased demand in the United States has mostly been met from Guanajuato in Mexico. Their production has increased quite a lot. So they're now up to about 25% of our US consumption from, it was maybe 4 or 5% before. It's increased a lot. And it's basically the entire increase in the demand has been met by Mexican production, a tiny bit by Eastern production, but some of the Eastern demand has been met by Eastern production. So it is happening. I would say that so before it was like almost all the production was in Maine. There's a little bit of winter production in Florida. Florida production has expanded and has expanded into South Georgia and a little bit South Carolina for supplying the winter market. Maine is staying steady. The largest increases have really been in the mid-Atlantic. So the higher elevations in Virginia and North Carolina is where we've seen a lot. And that is partly because there has been strong distribution out of that area for new broccoli growers that we haven't had to the same extent in New York. So that's why doing it. Why don't people do it? There's a lot of reasons. So the top 5 varieties that are not adapted to the East, that's what we've been mostly working on. That the markets, despite the high demand, the markets that you have are not making it worthwhile. Then the biggie, especially for this audience, you've already raising cabbage, or you're already using crucifer cover crops for important roles. You don't have space for more cole crops. Then number 4 is that it takes too much labor. So when we look at grower surveys of what their biggest issues are, it's almost always labor. And in the last few weeks, that has certainly been top of agenda for New York vegetable growers. And of course, that is an issue in broccoli too, because it is a hand harvested crop. And then finally, lack of cooling. We found this to be a tremendously important limitation to producers. So what do you do about unadapted varieties? So this is where we've been growing varieties that are more adapted to the Eastern climate. And one of the nice things about raising in Salinas is that you have extremely fertile soil. You've got really quite predictable rainfall. You've got irrigation. You've got cool nights. It's really an ideal climate for growing. In the East, we get quite a bit of water. We just don't necessarily get it when we want it. It can be too much, too little, high humidity. The high nighttime temperatures that cause deformation of the heads is a real problem. And just the variability from year to year, from week to week, from county to county is enormous here. So we need a high level of environmental resilience in each and every variety that we plant. And the old varieties just did not cut it. So one thing is not to raise the old stuff. That's a pretty easy one. So Pac-Man's was an old reliable one. It's consistently mediocre, which was the best we could do it in the past. But mediocre doesn't cut it in today's market. So okay, Pac-Man doesn't work. Green Magic was very popular when we started this project because it was the best modern variety for the East, but it's not a very good one. New ones are a lot better. Marathon, classic fall variety, had a huge market. You see it in just about every catalog, completely inappropriate for the East. If you really want to go back, the Chico, an open pollinated one, it's essentially unimproved from when broccoli was imported to the United States from southern Italy 100 years ago. It makes a nice small bunching broccoli. It's still very popular with market gardeners. It has a great story behind it, but it is not a commercial broccoli variety by any stretch. And then any variety that's been bred specifically for Salinas. Because Salinas is a giant market, all the companies have their breeding facilities near Salinas. They are breeding for Salinas. That's not our climate. So things that do well there are not necessarily going to do well here. So we need stuff that works well in the East. So we've tested a bunch of material and have worked with seed companies to develop new material. So the current leader in the East is without a doubt Eastern Crown. It's probably over 50% of the market because it makes a very heavy head. It's a big yielder and it is pretty resilient. We have planting trials where we've managed to get it to break down too, so it's not bulletproof, and more adapted things are coming along. There's a new variety out called Abrams that does quite well. Imperial has been the worldwide hot season variety. So if in areas where they're growing in a warm season, going into a hot season, desert, that sort of thing, they often finish with Imperial. And so it plays a role there. We can make that one come apart here also. Lieutenant is one that was, it was released by Seminis a long time ago. They had the seeds, they had just stopped selling it because it didn't really compete in Salinas, but it turns out it does quite well in the East. So they got it back on the market. So it's basically back on the market just for us. And so that's been playing a meaningful part in the Eastern production. Bernie came out from Bayo early in the project. It was one of their first crosses that was tested specifically under Eastern conditions and stood out as doing well. So that's been on the market for a while, and that does well. Bay Meadows is a variety from Syngenta that was similar story to Lieutenant, that it does well. It's very early, but it holds up well, and it's basically only on the market for the East. So it may not justify marketing by Syngenta for very much longer, but for the time being, that's good. And then we have new stuff coming. That's the exciting part. Things with numbers, things that seed is being increased and they're planning the marketing campaign. Actually some of those with the seed they have, they're trialing those at some of the larger growers. So they're kicking around. So if you're a big grower, you may have heard of some of those numbered materials. So there are varieties to use. So I'm big emphasis on get good material. For the market, marketing vegetables is a killer business. Boy, that is one lesson that I have learned from being part of this project. So I don't know that I can give experienced growers any great insight on this one, but perhaps the rest of you who haven't been immersed into this, some of the challenges. So we thought naively in the beginning that with so much broccoli on the market, so much demand for broccoli, every supermarket, every institution has to have broccoli. And so there should just be this big marketplace for broccoli, and you just get a broker and put it on the market and you get whatever the market price is, and that works out okay. No, nothing like that. So just calling a broker when you harvest, you're probably going to get a lowball price. So that's not going to work. Trying to compete directly with the commodity channel is really hard because you're going to be the lowest priority, going to get the lowest price, and just those established relationships are not there. That's not going to work. And again, it's another relationship thing. Walmart is actually considered by the people who deliver to Walmart to be quite a good, reliable buyer of broccoli. If you follow their rules, they always accept the product and they always pay you for it on a timely basis. Wonderful from a, it's not the highest price, but what the price is going to be, so you can make sure that you're producing. So people like delivering to Walmart despite their reputation for really driving prices way down for suppliers. But you can't get a Walmart contract if you don't already have a relationship with them. They like people they've been working with for a couple of decades. So calling them up and trying to get on their list is pretty unlikely. So do try building on existing relationships. This seems to be what has been successful. And so there are many buyer relationships. In fact, just to jump back on Walmart, I've seen some places where they've wanted more supply from a particular grower they can't deliver, but they can be the agent for neighboring growers to deliver on their Walmart contract. So then it's the relationship between the neighbors. Can that neighbor deliver to Walmart specifications at the production cost? So it builds on that relationship, so the trusted relationship between the wholesale buyer and the grower, and then the grower relationships. Some of those work well, some of them work terrible. Your relationships. Another is to identify the exact consumer specifications. Every customer has different specifications that they want. The kind of box, the length of the stem, the diameter of the head, how much stuff is, how much broccoli is in a box, the amount of ice, has to be ice, no ice. Very different specifications. You have to know exactly what they are and that you can deliver them. That is super important. And then we're seeing local institutions, particularly in New York State, there's incentive for schools and institutions to buy local, and they are interested and they don't know how to do it. So talking to local school districts to see what they want. Broccoli is a nice back to school in the fall, having it on their menu, but what exactly do they need? What kind of price can they pay? What's the volume that they're interested in? You have to figure that out usually well in advance. But that's where we're seeing some real possibilities. School districts and also senior housing, they go through a lot of food and they like to serve people vegetables, and broccoli is really easy for them to use. So that's a local institution they can have significant volume. All right, other cole crops. Since we have brassica growers here already, if you're doing well with what you have already, then probably it's not broccoli. I mean, that's going to be one of the simple answers. But if you do want to try broccoli, so one thing, don't try to shorten your crucifer rotation. That will only lead to disaster. So that's, I think, Christy talked quite a bit about that in the preceding talks on just the insect front, on why you don't want to do that. And the other thing is not to try raising broccoli as if it were cabbage. So they both like high fertility ground. So in terms of getting the broccoli planted and the first few weeks, that is very similar to cabbage. You do have to plant broccoli at roughly 3 times the plant population of cabbage to make money. But that's not a hugely difficult transition. But other than that, what are things to try? So first of all, doing small acreage where you have a market that you think you can get a high enough profit margin to justify it. That's definitely worth trying it. It's too expensive a crop to grow to have a bunch of speculative acreage that doesn't work. But then exploring the in-season market channels that may complement your marketing season, particularly with storage crops. So that would be late August, September, October. And then if you can pull it off, if you're close to the lake, you might be able to. Demand really goes up for Thanksgiving. And some years you can, it's cool enough that the broccoli holds reasonably well in the field. And if you're using brassica cover crops for soil health benefits, think of broccoli as your cover crop. So it's almost playing that role for the lettuce growers in Salinas. But they're using it for disease control. It's actually pretty good as a cover crop. It's way too expensive to use as a cover crop. That's why it's not used. And so incorporating it quickly, and you just heard why incorporating quickly is valuable for the Swede Midge management. You don't want old broccoli sitting around in the field. That's not going to help anything. But the residue and the broccoli roots can be quite valuable for disease control and for recovering nitrogen. So those are, so there's not a lot of answers on this one, to be honest. It's just, if your other cold crops or brassica cover crops are playing an important role, it is very difficult to justify getting into broccoli. But if it would be if on the market front or on the rotation front, you have a good reason to do it. Labor is a tough one, of course, and nobody's coming up with easy solutions on that one. So you're probably not going to find extra labor for the broccoli harvest. But another aspect, if you do have labor, is don't try using untrained labor because the specifications are so particular. You need a trained broccoli crew to do it, and you can definitely train one. We had one of the medium-sized broccoli companies in California. I was talking to them about labor. What about sending one of their harvest crews to New York for the harvest season to supply their markets in the East, and then they'd save themselves the shipping and they'd have control over the quality because they had their own crew. And, they were thinking about it. And, they really didn't have a spare crew, and that they might have a spare cauliflower crew, but that was kind of unimaginable because the cauliflower harvesters really didn't know how to cut broccoli right. So that gives you an idea of the level of precision that they were looking for in their broccoli crew. So the one solution that I've seen work the best is timing the broccoli harvest on your farm when it complements your harvest availability. So there are peak and slack seasons for every crop. And so putting broccoli in where it's a slack season for your other crops, that not huge insight in coming up with that one, but that because the broccoli is really pretty predictable when the harvest is going to come up, you can time that reasonably well. But with the crews, you have to practice for the speed and the cut and the presentation in the box, because that's what the buyers are looking for. I've timed the broccoli crews and they run about 3 seconds per head average going down the field. So that's a pretty good clip. And if I know one farm was paying piece rate, they were paying $1 a box. So if you're going to have somebody making enough money at $1 a box, they are moving fast. So getting the technique down for how to move at that speed while keeping the quality just tip top. One buyer may want a stem that's 3 fingers and the other one wants just 2 fingers. You need to get that knife to hit the stem at just the right spot every single time, every 3 seconds. It's not easy to do. It takes a special crew to do that. So you do have to practice that to get it where it's up to snuff. And the final one is lack of cooling. And this is what the big distributors tell us. We'd like to source more from New York, but there just isn't the cooling capacity. We need to be shipping cold broccoli that has ice on it. And so letting the broccoli stay warm is just not a player. It goes bad way too quickly. You have to cool broccoli. You have to have the capacity. And if you don't have the capacity at all, there are some local markets where they're going to use the broccoli immediately. They're not very big, but that would be the ones to get into. And the other is investing in cooling. And investing in cooling is expensive. There is no question about that. At the low end, I'd say $100,000 is probably the minimum capital investment if you're going to get into it. And $1 million or $2 million for a big grower is definitely in the ballpark of what it would cost to have enough refrigeration capacity, ice storage, the actual cooling equipment itself. There is some vacuum coolers for rent that you could lease for the growing season. But here I'm showing you a proof of a new bulletin coming out, an extension publication on cooling methods. This is just the proof from the latest version, but it should be out in a few weeks. And it would be a comprehensive guide for Eastern growers as to what would be the best the best option on your farm. So those are the top 5 reasons I think people are not raising broccoli. And in many cases, that is the right decision. But in some cases, there is a solution that could get you into broccoli. So those are some of my ideas on that. So with that, I'll take that one down.
All right, thank you, Thomas. So you just did a presentation in Canada, turn around, did a presentation in.
I did one in Sweden on Tuesday.
Oh my goodness.
Canada yesterday, New York here. So yeah, all over.
All right, well, thank you.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.